Welcome to High Growth Matters, an open comp podcast for influential players in the pre-IPO ecosystem. This show shares insider knowledge about building a badass business, and the expert conversation you're about to hear will cover everything you need to know about hiring and retention, fundraising, leadership, diversity, and more. Let's get to it. We all know that the best way to get something done at a high growth company is when a founder believes that it's important. And so today, Nancy and I are really excited to speak with Brian Kaiser, the co-founder and CTO of Hudl, which we'll learn about in a moment, about their journey towards pay transparency over the last 12 to 18 months. And I'll let Brian tell us what Hudl is, but it is a Series D company backed by impressive venture capitalists like Accel and Bain and others. Brian, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome. Happy New Year to you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to co-found Hudl?
Yeah, you bet. Me and my two partners, John and David, we founded Hudl about 16 years ago now. And the idea really came out of a need we saw at the University of Nebraska athletic department. And we started working with the football team there. And you got to imagine 16 years ago, this is actually before YouTube, before any kind of online video sharing existed. And they were really struggling to help their athletes train, especially when they're outside the facility. So we built them a software package that allowed them to take all their coaching, their expertise, and kind of extend the impact of it outside the walls of the athletic facility. And that was the impetus, is how can we basically leverage coaching and make it more effective for everyone? And over the years, it's grown and grown. And so it has many different products and aspects now, but that was kind of where it started back in the day.
I love it. And how, speaking of the number of products and just the distribution of your team, the size of your employee base, what does that look like today?
Yeah, so we've got, it's a little different in this remote world, and we have siloed offices, but I'd say about 15, what we call like full offices around the world at this point. So we have a couple in the US, I guess about 4 in Europe, several across Asia and Australia, and we've got about 3,200 employees globally at this point, and it kind of all roles. So, product sales, marketing, our offices are pretty mixed. But it really is a pretty global footprint at this point. And it really allows us to serve our customers better. We have customers worldwide, and so we need to have a presence worldwide. We've also grown pretty successfully through acquisitions. We've done 11 acquisitions in the history of the company. And so a lot of our office locations might appear a little non-traditional, like Chiavari, Spain, or Chiavari, Italy, I apologize, or Almeria, Spain, but they're due to acquisitions. And so we've been able to bring on board really talented companies and bring their teams on board and kind of continue to grow those locations. So it has some unique travel and location challenges, but it's something we're really proud of, and we've had some pretty great teams there.
I would be so okay if OpenComp acquired a business in Spain. I think I might move.
Or Italy, for that matter. You can go to Spain, and I'll go to Italy.
It's kind of an inside joke at Hudl that we tend to have a pattern of purchasing companies on the Mediterranean, and so I don't exactly know why, but it has kind of worked out that way recently. So it's not horrible spots to visit. They're quite beautiful.
Well, congratulations on all your success so far. Very exciting. And, pay transparency has really been top of mind for a lot of companies, and in particular for you all. When and why did that become top of mind?
Yeah, it's interesting to reflect on that a little bit, because it really has been a journey over a long time. I think some of the background is important. We started as a company that was founded by 3 kids right out of college with no previous work expertise. And we knew that we're not naive or ignorant. And so we required a lot of help to kind of build the company and grow. But even with that help and that mentorship, we barely knew what we were doing. And so things like pay transparency and just pay equality in general was an afterthought. And it wasn't that we didn't care, it's that we didn't even know to care. It was that kind of, unconscious ignorance that you might say around it. Obviously, you kind of grow and you mature and you learn. And so over the past several years, we've grown to a scale, especially in a complexity where we've had to care. And, you get burnt by it a couple of times and you realize this is something we need to get good at and we need to take serious. And so that's kind of the first trigger. And that I'd say that happened, 4 or 5 years ago, honestly. So not super recent. But then the question is, what are you going to do about it? And that's when you really start to put plans in place and get serious about it and make it a priority. And that's really been over the past 2 years, and really high focus in the past even 12 months on it. So even though we've been around for 16 years, we're kind of early to mid in our journey, candidly, on that. And it's not due to lack of caring. In my opinion, these things take time, and I think it would be a mistake to rush it. You've got to have the right things in place, but we're still early on our journey, in my opinion, on it. But it's not due to lack of caring. It's just due to kind of time and phasing, how our company looks, in my opinion.
And I think many of us are in that same spot, perhaps not even as far along as you are in terms of timeline. So appreciate the humility, and just want to say you're among friends or listeners who are friends. I guess when you started, Brian, taking action on this intent, or what did it look like at the beginning, and what was the process like?
Yeah, I think for us, it kind of comes down to, well, the way we like to operate as a company in general is we like to visualize the end goal. We like to say more, the North Star for Hudl. So we want to visualize, where do we want to be? And then you start to back out the steps on the journey to get there. And I think that's the beginning for us, is who do we want to be as a company? What is the culture we're trying to build? Where do we think we can be from a, compensation philosophy point of view? And I think those are just hard conversations to have, because it's really easy just to always want to pay more, or also want to be tighter on money. But when you really get down to it, where do we want to be? Where do we need to operate as a company? That's a hard conversation to have that involves a lot of leadership in the company to really sort that out. And so that took a while, but I think we figured out that North Star, and then you start to back up. Okay, what steps do we need to take to get there? What's the journey that's going to take us a couple of years? And so we've laid that out. And so then you start to lay out, okay, step number one, and we can obviously dive into more details if you all want, but we had a deficit around manager training. So we need to get our manager training dialed in, because I think that without that, kind of the later steps start to fail. And so, okay, then we need this. And then we need to do this deep pay band study. Well, it's easy to say that, but we're 3,200 employees across, I think we have people operating in 24 countries. That's, as you all are experts on, that's pretty complicated. So what does that actually look like? Where do we actually need to do that? What does that look like? And then you start to do analysis. What does that mean for us financially? So now we've got pay bands and we have our philosophy. Where are people at? It's one thing to say these are our bands. It's another to actually take action on them and do something about it. And so we basically lay out this whole roadmap, and we start working down it, and we just work towards our North Star. We know it's going to take a couple of years, and that's okay. So I think that's how we kind of laid out the journey, but it all starts with understanding, where do you want to be from a comp philosophy? Where do you want to be from a transparency point of view? And then the rest of it, just kind of work out the roadmap.
Yeah, and I think the long-term horizon that you gave yourself, sorry, Nancy, it seems very realistic in terms of just knowing it's going to be a long journey. That seems to me to be a very thoughtful way of approaching it, or an intelligent way, because it's not something that we can generally address overnight, particularly in a high growth environment where there's some pretty real implications for cash and what that looks like.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We're a Midwest company at our core. We're honestly pretty fiscally conservative. And I think that's a challenge sometimes in the tech space, because we are competing for top talent. And so we're competing against coastal companies. We have a lot of remote workers. We compete against every other big player on that. But we are pretty conservative. And so we need to be true to who we are. We're not going to be able to, fundamentally shift our comp philosophy or, deal with some of the pay challenges overnight. It takes time. But I think the best thing to do is also to be honest with the company. So we've outlined all this with the company. So it's not just transparency on pay, it's transparency on process, right? And so it's like, this is the journey we're on. This is where we're at in the journey. This is the timeline for the journey. And I think people give you a lot more grace when you kind of are more open about even the process itself.
True. That definitely endears loyalty. And so kudos to you all, and as you have developed the comp philosophy, and thought about it from a long-term perspective. And as you mentioned, you are conservative as a company. How have you balanced all that to be able to kind of afford the employee growth, the recruitment, the retention kind of shifts in market? There's been a lot going on there.
Yeah. It's, the honest answer is we've had plenty of failures, I guess. That's how we balanced it. It's been a trying time coming out of the deep recesses of the pandemic and the ways that wages and hiring and growth have been in the market. It's been a roller coaster ride, and I think we struggled a lot at the start of that. Candidly, I think we didn't have pay bands. We thought we had a comp philosophy. It wasn't nearly clear enough, and it made it really challenging to hire and market because we didn't know what we could do and couldn't do, and so therefore hiring managers struggled. Right? If you don't understand the bounds that you need to operate within as a hiring manager, how are you supposed to operate? Basically, you're always there guessing and wondering, and you never know what to target. And it was hard. And so I think that was another big push for us to get this right, is those failures, candidly. But now I think we're still very early on the journey, but we have a much better understanding of where we're at. And I think if you talk to any of our hiring managers in the Hudl, it's been incredibly helpful, because when we go out into the market and we ask salary expectations early in the process, some people are just going to be out of our bands. They're out of our comp philosophy and where we're going to be. And it's their market percentile is just too high. And we know that, and that's okay. And that's lovely for that person. And we can move on from the conversation. The other thing it lets us do on the flip side, if someone comes to us and they're too low, right, we can actually, make them a much more compelling offer. And I think it helps people realize that we do have a philosophy. We do want to pay and hire people within bands. We're not just trying to be cheap and save money. And so I think people see both sides of that. And that's that balance that kind of builds that loyalty and helps hiring managers actually be able to do their job better.
I think you hit on a really important point too, of the fact that as it relates to compensation and pay transparency, the manager is really the microphone, right? For you as the founder, because the employee is going to go to the manager to ask questions about his or her salary or offer or whatever it is. So I really just wanted to call that out, because I think it's a great focus. It seems like you have. As it relates to holding yourself accountable, and I imagine communication is part of this, just because you've mentioned that already several times, Brian, how does Hudl approach communicating about goals, progress towards goals, staying accountable to them in a way that's realistic and transparent?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll talk you through how we do it. I'm not going to say it's perfect. It's probably far from perfect, but at least I can chat about it. So we do a couple of things. We really, really try to be transparent on all company goings and financials. And to that point, we have a thing, we call it the weekly leadership briefing. And it's this internal newsletter, and it's all of our financials, revenue by division, expenses, hiring, everything. And it goes out to the whole company every week. So the whole company gets a snapshot of where we're at, hiring, financials, product, marketing, every major thing. It goes literally to all the leaders and to all the employees at the same time every single week. And it's the same newsletter. It's the same thing. And so I think that helps build alignment a lot. If the company is having a really good financial year, or if the company is having a tougher financial year, having that common understanding is really, really helpful, I think. And there's no reason to be ashamed of it. Every company goes through cycles. But it's hard to have conversations if employees think that we're just rolling in cash and we're making all this profit and we're banking it. They probably are less receptive to having conversations around comp philosophy and where we're at in the market, right? And so I think that transparency is really helpful. The other thing we do is, for any big announcements like a strategy, we have a very rehearsed playbook for rollout strategy for it. I think that's one of the most critical things we do, where it's, it goes to exec team, and then it goes to VPs, and then it goes to directors, and then it goes to managers, and then it goes to all employees. And that happens relatively quickly. So it's normally 2 to 3 days for any big announcement that we go through that progression. But what it does is we get the right people in the loop so they can answer questions as it continues rolling out. Like, the worst thing that we found is when a manager hears about something from their employee, and the employee's like, why did this happen? And they just heard about it at the same time. And that doesn't give them the ability to actually, for them to understand it, be able to answer questions about it. So this kind of hierarchical rollout strategy is something we do for any big company announcement, and it's been very, very effective for us. It allows us to get questions on the table earlier and have the whole company be on the same page. We used to think of ourselves as, ridiculously flat, and so we'd announce everything to everyone at the same time. And that sounds really great, but the reality is it actually just leads to more questions, and people aren't able to get them answered, because once you get to a certain size, not everyone can go and ask me my opinion on it, right? You've got to be able to talk to your manager and your manager's manager. And so you've got to allow information to distill down. So that's been really, really effective for us, is doing that. And, we're big Slack users, surprise, surprise. And so we have, a Slack group for just about everything, and that affects our strategy of communication. But to me, I think that rollout strategy is probably the most effective thing we do. And we do it for every big announcement in the company.
So as you think about the rollout strategy, is this something that applies as you plan to roll out the new pay bands for your teams and communicate it throughout the company?
It sure does. Great question. And it actually affects, the timing of it, the urgency. So to give you an example is we have pay bands rolled out to the VP level currently. So all VPs have pay bands for everyone beneath them. And then coming out here very shortly, rolling it out to directors. And then we're doing all of our management training. We're finishing it, and then we'll roll out to managers. So it's the same progression. It's obviously not over 3 days, right? Because training is a huge part of this, and that takes a little more time. But it is the exact same progression on down, and the same kind of relative timing and gaps on it. But for us, it's like, how do we have the right people trained and the right people able to answer questions on it before it rolls out to the next level down?
And I'm sure the predictability and familiarity with this kind of a process with shifts and changes in the company is something that's welcomed by your employee base, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think everyone really likes it. I mean, at first you're always like, oh, I want information quicker and sooner. And I totally get that. And I would say the same thing candidly, but I think when you see it in practice, the feedback's been really positive. It's like, hey, if we have to wait an extra day or two to hear information, but we know it's going to be more consistent and you can answer better questions on it, that seems a price willing to pay for it. So I think it's gone over pretty well. I think the feedback's really positive, and we do a bunch of pulse surveys internally, and communication has only gone up, and we've done more regimented and standardized rollouts of communication. So I think the proof is also on the quantitative feedback.
That's a really good point, Nancy. Brian, there are two scenarios we've heard a lot about from customers, prospects recently. And the one scenario is where someone, let's say their pay range is 50 to 70,000 and they make 55,000, and they see a job posting for their role, and then they see that pay range. So then the question is often like, why am I not being paid 70,000? So that's scenario one. This is leading to a question, I promise. And then the second scenario is more on the side of sometimes when a company rolls out pay bands for the first time, which many companies are in the place of right now, given new California and Washington legislation that went into effect on January 1st. Sometimes they find that certain individuals are actually outside of a band. So if we use that same scenario, 50 to 70,000, maybe someone's making 48. So I guess my question for you is, in either of those scenarios, how does your team plan to talk to those individuals? And in the case where someone needs to be made whole, how have you thought about that? Because there are very real financial implications for the individual and for the company, right? In a high growth environment, that's something you have to be very thoughtful about these days. Yeah.
Obviously, both very important and very challenging questions. I'll start with the first one. So I think that, in my mind, identifies why the most critical part of this rollout for us is the management training. To me, if someone's at 55 and a 55 to 70 range, that should not be a surprise to them. And there's a lot of reasons to be at 55. I mean, maybe they just got moved into the role, right? Like, this could be maybe it's a, senior engineer role, and it's their first year as a senior engineer. And so they probably should be at that end of the band. That's a logical spot for them to be. Maybe they're underperforming, right? Maybe they switched roles recently or switched responsibilities. There's lots of reasons that you could be. But what I've found is in most of those cases, those conversations aren't happening effectively with the manager. And they're definitely not happening effectively if there's a surprise. And so I think the most critical part there is getting ahead of those conversations to not have surprises. Being at a lower end of the pay band is actually not a bad thing necessarily. 2 out of the 3 examples I just gave were not bad things. They were just, reflections of reality of the situation. And so I think that's where the gap in knowledge, in my opinion, gets missed so much. And that's why we're taking so much time to roll it out and do manager training. That's such a critical piece. The other piece that we're struggling with candidly is do we have full transparency in the pay band to all employees, or do we leave it at the manager layer and have transparency there? And they're responsible for communicating that down more individually. And we don't know the answer yet, to be very blunt. We're right now, we're committed to doing it down to the management level. We're not necessarily committed to doing it down to the individual level. We're worried about that layer of context being missing. And so we committed to here, and then we're going to assess and evaluate and see how it goes. And then we'll make the call on the next one down, depending how it goes and how people react to it and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's a really challenging. I'm actually, in a weird way, really looking forward to it, though, the more and more we do it, because I think it encourages honest conversations about people's growth journey. And I actually think it's super healthy. And so I know we had an employee leave last year, and this person had a different problem, but I think related, where they're actually over the top of the pay band. And they were therefore getting really small raises because they are over the top. And it was okay, right? Like they came in from another company, they negotiated really well. But based on their performance and their tier, they were up here and the pay band was right here. And the problem is, because we didn't have the right coaching and the right mentorship around their management, those conversations weren't happening effectively. And so they thought they were underperforming. And the reality is they were performing okay. They were just over the pay band. And those are real conversations that I think it's just better to be honest about it. Otherwise, it leads to misunderstandings. So I think it can actually go both directions on that, on your number one. I guess number two, also a tricky one, probably bigger financial implications. And so I think for us as a company, step number one is to kind of do that outlier assessment. So we've done that on all of my teams, and we're doing it on the rest of the company here over the next quarter, but to understand where those misses are, where we're low, basically. And the good news for us is we don't have too many of those. So, that's a good thing for us. You don't know what you're going to find when you do this, candidly. You just don't know for sure. But I think, we wanted to do that analysis before we commit to anything to anyone. But I will talk you through kind of our playbook for how we're going to deal with them. So I think, step number one is identify them, understand financial implications. And then what you need to look at, is that person truly an outlier, or are they in the wrong band? Are they an underperformer? And so we have to do that analysis in each person. Now, I know for sure we have a handful of people for a variety of reasons that are below their band and they shouldn't be. And that certainly happens, and it's the case here. And so then it's like, you got to come up with a plan. And, what we're going to do is we're going to communicate with that person directly. I think it's better just to be honest. So you sit down, you talk about it, you show it, and you say, this is the plan over the next year to get you back in a good spot. We are a very, fiscally conservative company. We're not crazy high margin, candidly. And so realistically, we're probably not going to be able to just bump everyone up. I just think that's the reality of our situation. We just couldn't afford it. So I think it's better just to be honest with employees and talk about it, and talk about a plan and what that's going to look like and how we're going to get them back. And so that's the plan. And luckily, we don't have too many, but that is a real thing. And it can happen for a variety of reasons. I know we have, one of the things we take a lot of pride in is we have people switch roles a lot within this company. So we've had a handful of people that have switched from the support team to go to the engineering team. Well, that's a big pay band diff. And we've had some misses in the past on that move. And we fixed basically all of them now, but like there's an example of one where, it's very unintentional, but people move and they get a little bit behind, and, things happen as things adjust over time. Obviously, now that we have these bands in place, that should happen significantly less, but it is a hard transition to make. And you got to do the financial analysis on it. We had some really tough conversations on our team when salaries were really spiking for us, or seemingly spiked around like 6-7 months ago. And do we need to adjust our bands? And one of those analysis was, what are the pay implications of that? Because it would have been dramatic for us. And so those are the tough conversations you mentioned. And it was going to be, we're going to have to, probably eliminate a couple of positions to pay for that diff. Or do we try to ride it out? Do we think it's temporary? Is the band going to normalize? And so I very much get that. Those are hard conversations to have, but it's better just to be transparent about them. And we even, talked with the whole company about that. We were very open in our company, all hands, about where we're at in our journey. I think that helps a lot. Just, be honest.
Thank you. And, a lot of this just is about the crisp communication and also the thoughtful planning that you guys have done to prepare for this. What it specifically as it relates to your managers, and I'm sure you have kind of, with 3,200 employees globally, you probably have quite a span of experience on your management team, I would think. And so, how are you training and preparing your managers to have these conversations that are sometimes easier and sometimes very difficult to have?
Yeah, we have someone whose full-time job is to do that, actually, around management training. So that we're very lucky and fortunate to have someone in that role that can spearhead this, because it is a lot, and it really does depend on the tier. But there's a lot of consistency around, role playing hard conversations. We're looking to our VPs to sit down with managers and go over each of their people and talk through what's your talking points, what's your conversation. Let's make sure that we're on the same page ahead of time. So it's a lot of like individual coaching, kind of one-on-one. And then just lots and lots of examples. There's a lot of good documents out there and books about how to have these conversations and how to talk about compensation. And so, it's sometimes required reading, sometimes recommended reading. But a lot of it is kind of the role playing and then the one-on-one analysis from the VPs about, let's make sure we have a plan for every single person. We have the talking points down. And then you just get reps under your belt. Like you said, we have managers at every end of the spectrum. We have people that have been managers for 2 months, and we have people that have been managers for 20 years and, and beyond. So it really is kind of individualized, but ultimately you got to have a plan for every person and your talking points ready.
You're probably teaching them some great, just lifelong management skills with having this as part of their process. No, in all seriousness, it's usually kind of the big elephant in the room, but no more. So
we're trying to make it not the elephant in the room. And again, we're not at the finish line here. I don't want your listeners to think that mission accomplished banner up for Hudl. We're perfect at this. I'm not saying that at all. Like we are on the journey. We are way better this year than we were last year. So I think every year we're getting better. But it's hard. Compensation conversations are hard, but we're trying to take the elephant out of the room a little bit. And a lot of that starts with just as much honesty as I think you can do as a company. I mean, everyone knows if you want to make more money, you can go work at Google. Like, that's not a secret. We don't have to hide that fact, right? But we bring a lot to the table in terms of benefits, total comp, culture, work environment. And so we think we can go toe to toe, but it's not always going to be comp. And it's okay to be honest about that. I don't think we have to hide that fact.
Yeah, that's really well said. And on that note, as you look back over the last, I guess about 2 years is what you said, and all that you've learned, what would you say to our listeners? And keep in mind their HR, how can they help their founders and their leaders better address the trade-offs that are pretty naturally inherent in pay transparency? And are there any nuances of difference in kind of growth at all costs seasons that we had last year, and then conservation or at all costs, kind of the season that we're in now?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think, for me, it does have to come back to business value, right? Or else why are you doing this? And I think that's okay to have that. It sounds kind of dehumanizing, but I don't think it is at all, because the good news is this is better for the business and it's better for humans. So it's kind of a win-win. So I think if you take it back, that it's helpful. And if you're looking to attract and retain the most talented employees, I think more and more of this is being demanded of businesses, and rightfully so, to be clear. So I think that's good. I also think it makes performance conversations easier. I really do. And I know from my experience, like, that's one of the hardest things is managing up your best people and candidly managing out your low performers. And I think this is actually a mechanism to help facilitate those conversations many times. And so I think there is a positive performance management aspect to it that's a little kind of sneaky under the surface, but pretty valuable. The other thing that we found is you continue to grow. If you're a high growth company, things will inherently get out of whack if you don't have processes in place and you don't have bands in place. And it's not due to bad intentions. It's due to inertia of, large systems, right? It's like you have enough people and enough different managers, enough different VPs, things get out of whack. And we have certainly seen that at Hudl. And so, investing in these systems early and talking about it and the training early helps you if you think you're a high growth company, because you're going to have to deal with this eventually. Might as well deal with it early. It'll make your life a lot easier if you do. I think in terms of fiscal conservacy, it's like, where do you want your pain? Do you want your pain now, or do you want your pain later? Right? It's like, you're going to have to deal with this. If you're underpaying people, you're going to lose good people, right? It's inevitable. And if you're overpaying people, you're going to retain people for a while, but you're probably not going to be fiscally stable in the long haul, and you're going to have pain later. So it's like, where do you want your pain? I would choose to deal with it up front and deal with it before it grows. That's always my philosophy. And I say that as someone that waited too long to deal with it and dealt with oversized pain. So I say that from a place of experience, not that I got ahead of it and am proud of our whole journey or anything like that. So, and it's hard, but I think, again, we're a very conservative company. So I don't think you have to go 0 to 100. It's not like you lay out these bands and you just snap your fingers and solve everything in 2 weeks. Like, ours is a multi-year journey, and we plot out our North Star. And I think that would be my probably one advice coming back to your question is like, advocate for what that North Star is. Don't get into the details yet. Just build alignment around where we want to be as a company, and then figure out the timeline and the details. And that will depend on your company, your growth trajectory, your fiscal capabilities, like all those things can factor into that. But if you all agree on where you're headed, it's a much easier conversation on how to get there.
And I think I might know the answer to this next question, because I think you might have just answered it, but maybe there's more to this. What's the most important thing you've said today that our listeners should remember and walk away and really digest and think about?
I'm a really, really big believer on, whenever possible, lead with transparency and honesty with employees. Now, there's many cases and situations you can't, and I totally get that. And I'm not just talking about HR things. I'm talking about everything at a company. But I really think that, you're probably hiring smart people, as I'm guessing you are. And so you should trust them to listen to you and to trust you. And you got to help people interpret data, right? That's what you're going to roll. But I really think one of the best things we've done as a company is that transparency of data. And it helps people understand where you're at in your journey. And it makes it easier to have honest conversations. And I think it builds a lot of loyalty. And so that'd be my one takeaway is, especially if you're starting a company or early, if you can lead with that early, it's easier. If you try to implement that later in your life, I think it's harder because you've built up more walls and barriers. And so I'm guessing knocking them down is more difficult. So I would strongly recommend people try to lead with that. I don't see a ton of downsides to it, in my opinion.
Agreed. Thank you.
Same. Brian, this has been fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing your journey and your perspective with us. And to our listeners, thank you for being here too. If you can leave us a 5-star rating, that would be wonderful. And also don't hesitate to email podcast@opencomp.com if you have any ideas for topics or guests. Have a good day, everybody. Win top talent while strengthening runway with OpenComp. Thousands of the world's fastest growing companies use our compensation intelligence platform because it offers the most competitive benchmarks and insights available. To learn more, visit app.opencomp.com/signup.